Let's talk leases with Scott Trench and Chad Carson. Actually, with Chad Carson and Scott Trench. We'll do it that way.
Yeah, good to be here. Glad to talk to you guys.
I'm very happy to see you. I don't know what happened last time. It just went away. So, and then all of a sudden it stopped. I was able to see you guys, or I was able to hear you guys. I couldn't see anything, but I could hear you. So, okay, let's talk leases. We are here today with Chad Carson, who is also Coach Carson. You can keep up with him at BiggerPockets. With Clemson Investor is his username. You can keep up with him at Coach Carson. At Coach Chad Carson on Twitter. And he has a website, coachcarson.com. He has been featured on 2 BiggerPockets podcasts, one about creative financing, which was show
87, I believe.
Show 87. Thank you, Chad. And one was about 7 ways to find incredible deals, which was show 141. That was a live podcast at a financial conference called FinCon, Financial Media Conference. We actually, all 3 of us were there. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, it was.
So, Chad, let's get right to it. Let's talk about leases. How many properties do you have? How long have you been renting properties? Let's get your experience first.
Sure. Yeah. So I've been doing real estate full time for about 13 years now. So I graduated from college in 2002 and jumped into this about a year later and just figured that I had a car free and clear that I could live in. And worst case scenario, if I couldn't find any real estate, I'd just live in the car, And so I've been kind of growing it from there and buying and selling. But then we quickly got it. The end game for me was always to get in rental properties. I love the regular systematic income for rental properties. I love owning something tangible, both from a cash flow standpoint and wealth building standpoint. So we don't have to tell all the BiggerPockets people all the advantages, but that's what got me into it. And but so we sort of learned as we went. I think Scott and I were chatting briefly before we got on the call about how when you first start, you sort of you figure things out. Do you go pay a lot of money for a lease? Do you go use the standard lease that somebody in your local networking gave you? And that we kind of took the second route. We actually found just a standard lease that the state of South Carolina puts out through the Realtors Association that is free on the internet. And we sort of just started with that one. And actually 13 years later, we're still using the same one. It's been something where, I thought about with my rental properties. The lease is sort of an instrument that we use to kind of execute some bigger purposes for us. And the rental properties for us I mentioned the regular income. The lease is sort of the relationship, the thing that binds us between our tenant, who is a really important part of our team because they're the ones who pay that income every month. They go out to work, they go do all these things. And so we have to keep them happy, and we also have to keep them, within the rules of what we're trying to do. And that lease is just that written agreement that, yes, has some legal teeth to it. So in the worst case scenario, which doesn't happen that often, we have to go file an eviction, that it gives us that legal right. But more importantly, for us, it's sort of been it's that kind of management agreement, almost like if you're going to go work a job, you'd have a job description, you'd have a checklist of what your expectations are for your employee. And that's that's the tack we've taken with our leases, is that, to the extent that it really describes very well what the job description is for our tenant, it's a good lease. And so we use it as that kind of tool to help us train and talk to our tenants up front and set expectations.
So I have a question about that. So like you mentioned, I used I went around with you, at least with my first lease year, which I signed back in March of 2015. And I just went to a local investor that I knew and trusted and kind of walked me through the property, and I picked his brain a lot. He was like, "Oh yeah, here's some forms, use them." So I used them for the rental application. I used them for the lease. I used them for all sorts of things. And, I think that was really scary for me at the time, because I was like, maybe I should go to a lawyer. Maybe I should spend hundreds, thousands of dollars. But it sounds like, that may not be a totally ridiculous approach, without giving any legal advice. It sounds like, that could work for you even down the line. Just, hey, here's a standard lease agreement that is common among other investors. And maybe you don't necessarily need a lawyer to check it over at first, or maybe you do. What situations would you kind of say that applies, where you can kind of just go out and get one versus having to go get legal counsel?
Yeah, I think it never hurts to have a lawyer on your team, first of all, because you need to build a team. And I think it wouldn't hurt to have them involved in it. But I think one of the most intimidating things as a brand newbie is, do I need to go and like have somebody draft it from scratch? And is that what I really need? And more the approach I took is, here's an agreement. Let me see if it works for us. And it kind of covers the main things. Like, does it tell the tenant that they're responsible for them cutting the grass, for example, or some basic kind of stuff. But then I did take it to an attorney, and I used 30 minutes of that attorney's time to say, can you look this lease over, and can you tell me, are there any kind of big things that stand out to you that are missing? And that's what I think people should do. Is that, for 30 minutes of an attorney's time, how much of that's going to be not as costly as it's not going to be a big barrier. And then you do that, you get a couple tips here and there. Maybe they say, look, why don't you add this addendum, because you haven't said anything about lead-based paint. That's not in your lease, and then you would add that in. Or maybe there's a state law you have. Every state is very different in terms of what their landlord-tenant laws are, and that's something, a recommendation I would make to everybody is print your landlord-tenant laws off, or put it on your iPad or something and read those. You can't read it all at one time. That's really difficult to do. But the best landlords I know, they know the landlord-tenant law better than anybody, and so that's super important. And your attorney early on can help you kind of say, hey, here's something you're missing in your lease and your standard lease, for example.
I want to jump in right here and say that I think that going to the Realtors Association is an excellent idea. I know a lot of people, I have seen a lot of recommendations. Oh, I'm just going to go to the stationery store and get a lease. And that doesn't really cover what you need it to cover. It says, here's the address and here's the landlord's name. And that's pretty much all that lease does. From the stationery store. So your lease, I actually talked to Chad earlier today, and I got a copy of his lease. It is 7 pages long, and it's from the Realtors Association for the state that you're in, that you're renting. All your properties are in one state, correct?
That's right. South Carolina. Yep.
So that is going to be a more comprehensive lease than the generic covers everything from the stationery store lease that you can find. I think that's really interesting. I'm actually a real estate agent myself in the state of Colorado, and I don't know if we have a lease or not. So I'm going to go that the agency, the realtors agency recommends. So I'm going to go and check that out when we're done.
Yeah, that's a really good tip. I think part of your professional training. If you were to be a doctor, an engineer, or something else, you get some training, right? You go through some steps, and I actually have my license. When I first started renting, I didn't, but it was really helpful for me when I took the course. I didn't have any expectations at all, but we actually went through some of the basic contracts, and most of them were listing contracts and things like that. But sometimes there's electives you can take for your continuing education, and very often they have to do with property management. And so if you're already a licensee, you could take a course on leases, and that's where you could really get into knowing this, and that could be your first step in learning leases better. And even if you're not a licensee, you can go to any of those courses and take them probably fairly affordably in your local area. And so I found general knowledge is good. You listen to a chat like this, you chat on the forums is great. And then you take that general knowledge and you go to your specific local group and your realtors, your local attorneys, somebody local there's going to be something they've gone through that they can plug in. And just to give you an example of what kind of tip you might get locally, in South Carolina, we have a little interesting part of the landlord tenant law that talks about how you disclose or how you give notice to your tenant if they were behind on rent, or if they did any other kind of breach of their lease. Well, typically, most people think I've got to send certified mail, right? You got to send either some kind of official notice where they sign off that you could show the magistrate, hey, they haven't paid their rent and I've given them notice before you can file an eviction. Well, in South Carolina, there's this little thing in the landlord tenant law that says if you put this exact sentence here in your first page of your rental agreement or your lease, if you put it in big bold letters that says you are here now, you are now getting notice that if you don't pay within 5 days of the due date, we can file an eviction. And as long as you put that in there, you don't have to give a notice. So that's the kind of little thing that maybe if you didn't get a local agreement, if you just got one from Staples or if I got one from Colorado and I tried to bring it here to South Carolina, I'd be missing out on a pretty important little trick that would be helpful for you as a landlord. And so that's the kind of thing that you might pick up from a local realtor, local property manager, local attorney.
And
that's a really, really great tip.
Yeah, that might cost you weeks or months of rent there in that case. my opinion. Have you had to use that example? Has that example come to be personally valuable to you in your real estate?
Yeah. So like I went up to we don't like to evict. I mean, I'm not one of the landlords who say I've never evicted before. We've definitely had to evict. But I like to talk about that. Why the properties I had to evict the most on were lessons in themselves. You know, I had to do a lot of management on these properties, not because of management, but because I bought the wrong property. You know, the ones where I just didn't buy in a good location, or they just didn't attract good tenants. I really had a hard time managing those. But the ones I have had evictions. So one time I went up to the magistrate and they asked me, well, where's your lease? Where's your proof that you've given notice to the tenant? And I said, well, my notice is in the rental agreement. They said, well, no, you have to have notice. And I said, no, it's in the rental agreement. And so we got it back and forth. And because I'd studied landlord tenant law, because I knew that, I said, hey, I mean, I'm not trying to make you wrong here. I've looked into this. I've researched it. In the landlord tenant law, it says I can give notice in my lease. And sure enough, she went back and checked with the magistrate. And she was new on the job, and she apologized and said, okay, let's file it, and went from there. But, you know, that's the kind of thing that you could have just, if you didn't really know about that, then you would have just said, oh man, I've got to go file notice. And you would have turned around and walked out, and maybe cost you a week or two before you could file the eviction.
So I'm sure that there's a lot of those nuances there, and that's a really good example of one. Like, I need to go back and really review the Colorado landlord tenant law myself here. But what are some of the big holistic things that a lot of maybe new landlords or new lessees kind of miss or might overlook, or might not bring to mind at the appropriate time when an issue comes up between them and their tenants? What are some important holistic parts of the lease that we should be really looking at how they're constructed and what those terms are?
Good question. So, I mean, for me, we're talking about basics here, and I think that's really important. You can get into a lot of the nuances. I mean, I got into one nuance there and spent some time on it, but the basics are things like how much is the rent, you know, and so that you think you kind of take it for granted, but here's the rent amount, and we actually when we have a 12-month rental agreement or 12-month lease, we put the total amount of rent. So it's $1,000 a month. That's $12,000 for the year. And I try to remind them. I say, you know, you are committing to $12,000 worth of payments over the next year. That's what this lease is. It's a 12-month lease. If it were a month-to-month lease, you're committing to 1 month. You know, and so that rent amount is really important, and you stipulate that in your lease. And then you start kind of getting more detail from there and start asking questions like, all right, what happens with that payment? So how do I make the payment? And so in your rental agreement or your lease, you want to say, here are the ways that you can make payments to me. And so you as a property manager need to decide that, you know, how will I let them pay me? Can they mail it in? Do they have to, am I requiring them to pay me just online with a bank? Or am I allowing to have them 2 or 3 ways to pay me? And so this again goes back to sort of that managing your relationship. That doesn't have to do with, you know, the legal part of how can I evict somebody, but that has to do with you're having a conversation with your tenant. And I really like in my lease to have all of the key points that are going to be important relationship highlights for us. I want to have those in the lease, so it sort of reminds me. It's just I'm going down the lease, I'm going through 7 pages. Each thing reminds me of something to talk about. So how much is the rent? When is it due? Is it due on the 1st? Is it due on the 5th? When do the late fees start? And do you have late fees? How much are late fees? Yep. So all of those things are around payments, and those are on my first page. So the how much the rent is, how much the late fee is, when the rent is due, is there a grace period? That's on the first page of the rental agreement. We spend the most time on that before we get into some of the other stuff. But okay, so I took a couple notes just on. So rent was my first thing. The second thing would be the term of how long the lease is going to last. You could have a lease for 3 years, and that could be beneficial to you. It might not.
Yeah, I actually signed my lease for 15 months because I signed them March 16th, and what I did is I gave them the first week 2 weeks free, so that I could have a lease that went a little bit longer and kind of expire in the summer months. So it seems to be a little bit easier to get new tenants in there.
Exactly.
And it just seemed like that would be a better time for the lease to expire. So definitely know that the term's important there. And I don't know, sometimes you might have to. It seems to me sometimes you might have to get up a little bit to get a longer term. So.
Absolutely. Yeah, in my market, every rental market's a little different. I'm in a college market, and so about half of my tenants are college students. The other half are just kind of normal families and people who live outside of the college town. And so for me, I really don't want somebody moving out in October, November, or January, February. That's just it's almost like I'm just going to have a vacancy. There's no doubt. And so every one of my leases begins in August, ends in July. And I'm not going to say there's not exceptions here and there where we might allow a tenant who's been with us a while to stay for 6 months extra if it's really, if I think I can re-rent it. But, for you and your market, you need to look like you did and say, when is the best time for me to have my tenants turn over? And so do you want to have all of your leases ending at one time?
Interesting.
That's something to think about, because if you had 10 houses and all of your leases ended on June 30th, all of a sudden you have to, that might be okay. In my case, that's the way it is. We have, 20 rentals turnover every July, end of July. And so we are really hustling. We're getting all maintenance people ready. But if you don't want to do that, if you'd rather spread it out, you might have one end in May, one end in June, another end in August. And that would be sort of a management practice for you to figure out when you want to not have everything vacant at one time.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question for you regarding your college rentals that all come up in August. I used to live in Madison, Wisconsin, which is the University of Wisconsin.
Yeah.
Go Badgers.
Yeah.
And we had move out night it seemed like there was an entire day where college students were just homeless and all their stuff was on the lawn. And it sounds like you guys have that too. Yeah. Does your lease end on July 31st and then the new one starts on August 1st? Or do you end a different way? How do you deal with turnover like that when you've got so many units and such a turnaround?
Yeah, when we used to have fewer tenants, like when I moved into a quadruplex when I was house hacking, I was in the college town then, and I lived in one unit, and we used to do July 31st and then August 1st. I mean, it was like a mad rush. They were moving out in the evening. We were cleaning up that night and touching up paint that night, and it was just. And sometimes there would be a problem, and so as we got more rentals, we started making it so July 31st is a cutoff, and then the next tenant starts August 6th. So we give ourselves a little 5 day grace period, and it's still intense. If you have a lot of units, that 5 days is tough. But you just have to be more proactive. I find it a positive that we have everything at one time, even though that's kind of a challenge, because we actually lease everything in February, March. So like right now is when we're leasing everything for August. That's when all the college students are looking to get their homes reserved for the next school year. And so we get everything leased early on. And so we know whether we're going to have any vacancies or not, and we know whether we need to hustle through the summer to try to fill those vacancies. And then we kind of can prepare all of our contractors and subs and painters and cleaners for that 5 day period, and then kind of hustle and get that done. And then the rest of the fall, you're sort of just in maintenance mode at that point. And so I like that, but it takes some systems and some structures. And last couple of years we've been working really on making our handymen. They sort of know what we want to do, but actually getting a checklist, like here's a painting checklist, here's a cleaning checklist, here's a kind of a maintenance checklist, so that I don't have to go through and do a punch list on every one. I want him to, here's the checklist, you go through it, take before and after pictures, go through that checklist and turn that checklist into me afterwards. And so we might have 20 checklists that we can then go back and if you look for exceptions, if there's a problem here or there, then we can go check on the property afterwards. And but it just it just takes some operational kind of systems to build it up to. But if you're doing one or two yourself, I mean, it's just it's the same principle. But I recommend getting some of those systems started early on. Like if you're hearing some little things, some tidbits you hear from all of us here, start implementing those on your first deal. Or like Scott's doing when you're moving into your second rental. That's the time to get these systems built because it's super easy to implement them at that point. And it might seem like overkill, but when you start growing and you now have a system that is scalable to 10, 20 properties just by doing that.
And definitely ask for an expert's advice and pick his brain right before you're about to go through that process. I think
absolutely, yeah,
a lot of value out of this right now. So for my business, unlike the college town, I'm planning on working a full-time job for at least another couple of years, and I'm going to do the rental on the side. And so your system of moving everybody in and out in 5 days sounds like a terrible plan for me. horrible experience in cleaning and trying to do work, really late nights all day, dawn to dusk.
Yeah.
So I think that for me, a great point you mentioned is, wow, I'm going to sign potentially 2 tenants back to back here with the 2 new units that I'm going to be renting out. Maybe I want to have one of them with a 12-month, and maybe I want to have the other one with a 13-month, just so that when that time comes up, I've got a much easier transition. I can manage them, much more leisurely, those transitions, and still have very low vacancies if they were to move out in a year from now. 13
I think that's smart. I think it's a smart way to do it. Yeah, definitely.
So do you go and before your July 31st move out date, do you go in and view the damage and view what you think needs to be done ahead of time so you can make a plan? Or do you had talked about giving the handyman some checklist and then do you just turn them loose and say, good luck? I mean, how do you reconcile the security deposit with the damage and, all that?
Yeah, good question. So there's a walkthrough that we do, either me or a person who works with me. And we'll do a walkthrough right after they move out, and just do, we have a move-in checklist. I guess we need to take a step back. There's a move-in checklist when the tenant moves in that says, here's the condition and all these rooms and all the wall, the kitchen cabinets, and you need to have a really detailed move-in checklist. And so you should have that when you walk through at the end. You have that move-in checklist, and you go down and look down the list with an after condition right next to it. And if it said there was a stain in the carpet in the living room when it started, okay, there's still a stain in the carpet when they left. Okay, we'll check that off the list. But if there's not, and so the things that I'd say 90% of the tenant turnover, like when we have to deduct security deposits, usually come with cleaning. There's a damage here and there, but it's typically cleaning. And so that's not something we really have to prepare for. But if we see that it's not clean when we do the checklist, we say, all right, the kitchen's nasty. There's trash bags all over the place. This is a cleaning. And and then we'll have to send our cleaner in. And they have a fee. If it costs them $125 to clean the apartment, that's deducted from their security deposit. But the important thing is to kind of separate in your mind when you're doing these repairs, which ones are tenant repairs and which ones are just kind of your normal thing. Hey, they've been in there 5 years. I'm just having to paint again. Mm-hmm. That's not the responsibility of the tenant. That's just a normal kind of wear and tear type item.
Right. Okay. I want to start talking back more about leases. You made it sound like you just don't hand a pile of papers to your tenant and say, here, sign these. It sounds like you walk them through your lease. Scott, do you also walk through the lease? And how long does that take? What do you point out? Do you read to them everything? I did look at Chad's lease, and he has a place on the bottom for 2 signatures plus the landlord's signature on the bottom of every single page.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So I'll tell you what I did, and then you can tell me where I went wrong, what you would do differently there. When I had the tenants there, I obviously read the lease 3 times myself to make sure I understood all the different components, and then I gave it to the tenants. I was in the room with them while they read it. I was there to answer questions. I pointed out things like, here's the rent, here's, if you want to have pets, they wanted to have cats, we're going to do that in a separate pet addendum. We talked about things, we negotiated a few things. For example, one of the things in the Colorado lease agreement that I had was, hey, when the term expires, if nothing happens, we're going to go to month-to-month tenancy, and it's going to be, the rent going to be at that point. Is it going to go up? Is it going to stay the same? And so we negotiated a $100 increase in rent at that time. But I would like to sign a lease, obviously, instead of doing that. But just those kinds of things. I didn't necessarily walk them through every section of the lease or every line of the lease, but I answered questions and was there to help them and it was there to mention the points that I thought were really important. So.
And how many pages is your lease, Scott?
6 or 7 here. I'll have to check.
Okay. I want to jump in right before Chad answers. A few months ago, I posted on the forums, hey, how long is your lease? Because I would see people saying, oh, I've got a 3-page lease. I've got a 25-page lease. And I really wanted to know. And, the answers really were all over the board. Mm-hmm. There are some people, I think 40 was the highest page lease.
Wow.
There's some pretty detailed stuff in there. So I do want to know how you walk your tenants through the lease. But I also want to point out, because we haven't pointed this out before, just because it's in the lease doesn't make it legal or enforceable. Yeah. I always wondered, well, why don't you just put, hey, if you don't pay me rent, I'm going to kick you out tomorrow. Well, because you can't. You have to follow the laws specific to your state. They're all different. There's 51, including Washington, D.C. I just did some research on this, and there are 51 different landlord-tenant laws. Nothing's the same except the landlord is the person who owns it and the tenant is the person who lives there. Every single thing else is different. So, Chad, how do you walk people through your lease?
Yeah, so I actually read a book by Mike Butler. I think Brandon Turner's recommended a bunch, and it really struck me that he did a process he called it a rent up or a lease up, and you could probably just give it to your tenant. You could give the lease to your tenant, and you could even email it to your tenant and say, "Please read this," and then sign it and then send it back. That would be the most efficient way to do it, and I'm tempted to do that just to be efficient with my time. But I think when it comes to people, efficiency is not what you're looking for. You're establishing a relationship. And so if you really, at some point you want the tenant to be pretty self-sufficient and handle things themselves. But I have found in any relationship, and this is a really important relationship with your tenant, that the more time you invest on the front end and the more detailed you get on the front end and the more trust you establish with one another on the front end, it's going to be much easier down the road. So let's just talk about a couple specific things. So rent and paying your rent on time is always a big deal. And so let's discuss, when we get to the section of the lease that has rent, you could just say, hey, your rent's $1,000. You can pay here. If you're late, this is what the late fee is. But what you could also do, and people learning in stories, they don't learn just from reading a technical, they're already intimidated by this technical lease. And so why don't you tell a story? Why don't you say, you know what, one time, this guy named Scott, he was renting my apartment, and he mailed his rent to me every month, and he called me. I called him one day because I said, "Hey Scott, your rent's not in. It's the day after the rent's due. What's going on?" He said, "Well, I mailed the rent, but and I said, "Okay, Scott, you mailed it. Now, when did you mail it?" "Well, I put it in the mail today, or I put it in the mail yesterday. It was due yesterday. I put it in the mail yesterday." I said, "Well, do you have it postmarked, or do you have anything that shows me that it's there? Because we haven't gotten it yet." And so you could use that story to tell, hey, you can't just mail it on the day that's due. It has to be in my office, or it has to be deposited in my bank account by the day it's due. And so that's a moment when you'd want to slow down, because it's really important for them to know when the rent's due, how they can get it there. And by you telling that story and kind of slowing the process down, you're doing that face to face, you're looking them in the eye, you see how they respond to things. You're sort of giving yourself a chance and them a chance to know how important that is and how it's supposed to happen. And so I think those are the moments, you mentioned, Scott, just going through the lease and kind of hitting the highlights. I mean, I don't go through every single detail. I mean, there's a lot of things, some things that aren't relevant, but also some things that I ask them, I say, I would like you to read all this over, and I want you to take as much time as you need. Your time is my time. We'll sit here and we'll take, you can read every single word, and I want you to. But I'm going to hit some of the highlights here and tell you some of the important things. And so that would be one of the highlights. Your rent is this much. Here's when it's due. Tell a couple stories about that. I'd also talk about the end of the lease. Like you mentioned, Scott, what's going to happen at the end of the lease. Mm-hmm. With all my students, it's a really important thing because it's a little bit unusual. We say your rent and your lease ends in July, but we are actually going to be re-renting the apartment in February or March. And so just be expecting in January or February, we're going to contact you to ask you whether you want to renew your lease another year. And that's going to be in February or March. And so you're kind of hitting that. That's not in the lease necessarily, but that's something you're getting a chance to discuss every one of those points. So the big theme here is you don't want any surprises. All the mistakes I've made, I've made tons and tons of mistakes, and I keep on making mistakes, but almost all of them have to do with three things. One, I bought a bad property. That was, if you buy a good property, it's going to be a lot easier to manage. Mm-hmm. So that was number one. I've made some mistakes there. Number two, I screened poorly. So, somebody has money and they're ready to throw money at you, and you don't do enough screening or thorough enough screening. And you just put them in the property because they act like they have money. That's mistake number two. And the mistake number three is what we're talking about here. So it's like bad communication and just not communicating clearly your expectations, not allowing them to ask you questions. And so that's why I like to take longer on that lease, because it gives you a chance to go slowly, see what's happening, to see if they have any concerns. In a worst case scenario, you've done all the screening of this tenant. You think they're okay, But what if you go through all this stuff and you show them how serious you are and here are my rules? What if you get the sense you're looking at them, they're totally resistant to a lot of the things you're telling them, and you could tell they really don't buy into all this. Should you move forward with the lease or should you not? Yeah, I mean, it's obvious, but if you would have emailed them the lease, they might have signed it and sent it back to you. And so is it worth a 30-minute to an hour interview at your time if you're self-managing, or one of your property manager's time? And I have found that as we have done that, slow it down both during the application process and during the rent-up process, that was one of the best moves we ever made, because we've now clearly communicated better. And we've also developed a relationship. So whether it's me or somebody, my business partner, that tenant now knows us. They have a name and they have a person that they've sat across the table from. So when there's a problem later on, there might be some emergency, there's water rushing out of the pipe somewhere. They have a real person that's on the other line. And if we screw something up, which is inevitable, they have a real person who we have a relationship with now. So it's going to be, as opposed to that evil landlord who they don't know, and there's already that kind of contentious relationship. So it's really an opportunity to sort of set the tone and kind of build upon something in the very beginning.
How many different ways do you have to allow them to pay you? I mean, obviously, you want the money, and I have seen people who, different people on the BiggerPockets forums will recommend, oh, well, I make them deposit it in my bank account, and that's the only way they can give it to me. And I don't want to check, and I don't want to make it inconvenient for me. And Eric Drenkhan, the no nonsense landlord, he's like, I want to make it as easy for them as possible. Yeah. I want this money, so I don't want to make it difficult for them to pay me. It sounds like you have a couple of different ways that you will accept payment. Yep. Because that's what this all comes down to. I mean, it's nice to be able to provide housing for somebody who can't otherwise afford to buy a house, but you're not doing this so that you can give free housing to people while you pay the mortgage all by yourself. Yeah. So, how many ways do you have to accept rent? Is there something that somebody has suggested that you've said no to?
Right. Yeah. So our general rule has been just like I think Eric's, is try to have as many as we can within reason. And so up until now, like today, we have we don't have an office. So I work out of my basement. This is my little office with old school chalkboard here in my basement. And so we don't have people definitely don't come to my house to deliver rent, but we do have a physical drop box in one of our apartments. So we have 2 duplexes next to each other, and we have a physical drop box, which we don't use as much now. And we're thinking about phasing that out, but we like to have some of our tenants just like to have a physical place to drop it off. And so that's number one. Number 2, we have a P.O. box, and that's where traditionally most people have sent it to our P.O. box. But then last 3 or 4 years, we've shifted more to and we didn't eliminate those other options, but we started offering a couple other options, which number 1 was having like an online payment. So they can go online and just connect their bank account with our bank account through a software that we have. And we use Buildings, a property management software. And so they have a plug-in, and there's lots of other online payment servers as well, but they can enter their information and set up an auto payment just like they do with all their other bills these days, and they can just connect it and just send it automatically digitally. So that to me is the best way to do it. It costs us 50 cents per transaction to do that, but for me, that's no brainer. I mean, how much time does it take to have to physically get a check and deposit it or take a picture of it or process it? It's just it's awesome for us. It's awesome for them. And so we've really been encouraging people to do that. And the very first month we offered that, we actually had an incentive. I think we did a $10 or $15 gift card at Walmart or somewhere we thought was pretty usable for everybody. And if they would sign up and start trying it out. And so, you can offer an incentive to get people to do one or the other. And I haven't looked at it lately, but I think over half of definitely over half are paying online now, whereas 4 or 5 years ago they weren't. So that's awesome. I love online payment. And then the 4th one we have, which is we have a mixture of tenants. We have student tenants who almost all either they or their parents pay the online now, or they mail it sometimes. But we also have some that just working class people. They might not even have a bank account. Believe it or not, there are some people that don't have bank accounts, and so they traditionally wanted to pay with cash, and we don't want to do that. Or they would have to go buy a money order at the post office or something. And so for those people, we actually have a Wood Forest Bank at the local Walmart, and there's Walmarts all over the place. And they're open 7 days a week. They have hours, Sunday from 1 to 5, and they can go right up to the teller. And we've kind of talked to the local tellers, and they'll, on a deposit slip, they'll pay their money to us. They'll put the company's name, and then they'll scan that deposit slip. They'll put who the tenant has to put their name and their property address. And so we can see online as soon as they paid it and give them credit that way. So that's our fourth. I said PO box, Dropbox, online payment, and then pay directly to the bank. Those are the four we've kind of worked with.
So the pay directly to the bank, that can be the people that don't have a bank account. They can just take a big pile of cash into the bank and say, "Here, that's my rent."
Yeah,
okay.
and then the teller gives them a receipt saying, "Here, you paid it." And so if for some reason we didn't get it or we didn't think they paid, they could scan a copy or bring a copy by and say, "Hey, here's my receipt. I paid it. Here's the date."
Yeah, and I got a question. So when I first collected the rent from my tenants, and I think in my lease it says that all checks and all payment must be mailed to my address, which is right next door to them. So I figured that would be a really easy problem.
Yeah.
But what I found is that they immediately wanted to pay the rent via an online payment platform. And that wasn't technically in the lease, but great. It's the easiest way for them. It costs me nothing. There's no fee for that. What do you feel about collecting forms of rent that may not be technically in the lease, as long as they're coming to you? So
I'm cool with it. I think that's fine. I'm not sure technically if that's a problem, but to me, the thing that I legally want to have in the lease, and this is just something you talk with your local attorney about, is can I enforce an eviction if something bad happens? And in that weird case where they don't pay the rent, can they do it? Other than that, though, everything else in the lease to me is a management tool.
Yep.
Mindy, to your point about how long is your lease, you could probably have a one-page lease that would get you through the legal process if you needed it, But maybe the reason you have a 20-page lease, or some of these people have 40-page, I can't imagine a 40-page lease, but a 7 to 10-page lease, the reason you would stack it up are these kind of things, Scott, is here are 5 ways to pay. And let's talk about them. And so it's your management tool. It's your relationship tool as opposed to the legal tool. So why not? Yeah, just put them. You can put it in there. And sometimes I'll handwrite stuff on a lease if there's some specific thing to that property that we need to write in there, and we all initial next to the handwritten part. So you could write that in. But I don't think the fact that it's missing is a problem. But maybe you go back in and you have a running kind of edited lease that you're going to keep working on, is that next time you're like, I need to add that in there. Or, if you do decide, Mindy, like this, some people do, if you do decide to cut off, like we are requiring one of these 2 payment types, you do put that in your lease. You say, this is what we require. We want you to do this or this. And that way at the rent up conversation, you can talk about it.
Awesome. That's a great tool. I'm taking notes. So it doesn't look like I'm really paying attention, but I'm typing notes because I'm going to turn this into a lot of information. Cool. I'll probably put this into, at the very least, a forum post and information underneath the replay that we're going to have at BiggerPockets.com when we're finished with this discussion. Because I did remember to record this time. Yay! Ask Scott about that.
Yeah. I sometimes forget to record my presentations that I give as well, and I now have a huge slide in the presentation in about 2 hours. The very first slide, which is, will this show be recorded? And that is not a question for them. That is
I like it. Yeah. See, that's exactly what we have this lease for. Half these things aren't for the legal reasons, just so I'll remember to talk about it. First page of the lease. You must pay your rent on time. Okay.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Scott.
Oh, I was just going to ask. You talk about as a management tool. What happens if you don't enforce something in the lease? Say it's in the lease, and that you're going to charge a fine, and you're going to charge it on the 5th day of the month. And if they don't pay by the 5th day of the month, you're going to charge them $50 plus $10 a day after that. And let's say you let it slide once, maybe twice. At what point does your lease kind of become void? I know that there's some legal ramifications to not enforcing those rules, to not carrying out the things that you've agreed to in the lease in terms of punitive charges to the tenants.
That's a good question. We need to ask, I know there's some attorneys on the forums, maybe that'd be a good one to ask, like legal ramifications. But I think in terms of this consistency, I think the point I'm taking from what you're saying, and I agree with, is you just need to be consistent. As consistent as possible. You don't want to make to be fair. I mean, there's laws about being fair and reasonable, but there's also just, you don't want to be picking and choosing when you do things and when you don't. It's a good policy to have. Hey, we pay our rent on this date, and like I have a person, the bookkeeper who works with me. We talk about this a lot, and I say, you're going to get a lot of stories. You're going to get reasons why people are late. And, if there's a reasonable chance that they can bring this current and they can do great, we will bend over backwards. I think our tenants will find that we're going to be more fair, more reasonable than anybody they've ever met, any other landlords. But on the other flip side is, if they're not communicating with us, if we haven't agreed ahead of time on this, and if our final day is the 5th of the month when they have to have it in or we won't file an eviction, on the 6th, I want an eviction filed if they haven't talked to us. It's like, we've been really harping on that, working on that. It's like that has to be consistent. That's not only, legal ramifications, I'm not sure, but management policy wise, you need to really stick to that kind of thing. And I think that's the most difficult part when you're sort of a part-time landlord, especially maybe when it's your house hacking, and hopefully you don't have to evict somebody when you're house hacking, but they're your next door neighbor as well. You've got to have some kind of detached process system that you work by. And this is where you borrow it from other people on BiggerPockets and other people you learn from. You stick to that system, and you can go to that person and say, look, this is the process. I'm sorry, we have to do it this way. And it's not me listening to the story and saying I wish I could help you. It's, we have to file an eviction on the 6th. That's the policy. If you can come up with it, you can come up with the rent, and I would love to help you do that. You call me, let's communicate. If you're getting paid Friday, fine. And so I guess that's my take on consistency, Scott, is just stick to it. And if you're going to make an exception, have a really good reason, but don't make a habit of that. Try to be consistent.
Gotcha.
Yeah, and it's a lot easier to make an exception for somebody who's been with you for 16 years, and then all of a sudden they lost their job, they're starting a new job. Okay, you know what? I can work with you. You've never been late before, but it's month 2 and you already are late. I would recommend sticking to your lease.
I found that a lot of elementary school teachers they have the most analogies for being a good landlord, because I've always heard, when an elementary school teacher, if you have these first graders who come in, and I've got 2 little kids, so I'm kind of in that mode right now. On the first day of class, if you let something slide and you made an exception to your rule on the first day of class, you are toast with those first graders for the rest of the year. I mean, you're done, because they will eat you alive. They know that you're a sucker and you're gonna give in. So I think this is landlording is kind of like that. Is that you're gonna love those kids. You're gonna be fair to them. You're gonna take care of them. But that first day of class, that first week, that first month as a teacher, they're gonna think you're a little bit more strict, and that's good. That's a good thing, because you stick to what you said you're gonna stick to. And then 16 months later, like Mindy says, then if you've had a good rapport with them, they've built a lot of credibility with you, they've done things right for 16 months, that's when the exceptions happen, not on the first 3 or 4 months.
Yeah. Go ahead, Scott. I was going to change the subject. I mean, a little bit.
Well, I was just going to say, so it sounds like to me what you're saying here is, and my 4 big takeaways from the day are, you got to know the law and make sure that you know what is and is not legal with your lease, what is applicable to your state and your region. And you got to communicate that with an attorney and have them review it potentially and make sure that those things are in place. And then beyond that, it's really, you really view leases not so much as kind of a legal document as more of a management tool to communicate how you're going to manage the property and your relationship with the tenant, and how you're going to enforce your any punishments or any monetary fines, things like that, when things go wrong. And and it's really the lease is only as valuable as your consistent enforcement of the provisions of the lease. So exactly. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, and not that you're not going to have it. It is always a legal document, but I don't want to go to court. I don't want to do it. I've had both with leases, I've done contract for deeds, I've done all sorts of different kinds of things where you're involved in contracts. If you have to go to an attorney and hire an attorney to help you out, everybody loses. Yep. And the attorney you'll talk to will tell you that too. I mean, it's not prevention and relationship and being clear. That's where you need to take control. And so a lease is a super valuable tool. It's valuable as a legal remedy to get the property back, but it's even more valuable if you use it correctly.
it's a really valuable tool for cementing that relationship and making clear the expectations, just like a job. I mean, think about it like a job. Think about I like to literally use these words, is that when you're sitting with the tenant, say, each of us have a job. My job is to deliver a property that is clean, that is safe, that you enjoy living in, that it's in a good location. We've taken a lot of pride in having this property be something that you'll like. That's step number one. That's my job. And then to keep it that way. If there's anything breaks, if the roof starts leaking, if something happens to the property, I want to know about it. I mean, that's our responsibility. So you hold me to that responsibility. But then your responsibility, and we're going to go over all these details of your responsibilities in your job, is to pay your rent on time, is to take care of the property as if it's your own, is to communicate well. If there are ever problems, to talk to me about it. And so I'm going to hold you to your job. And here are the consequences that happen if you don't follow the rules for your job. And that's sort of the frame that we presented in, is that job employee. It's not an employee. They're not my employee, but you almost look at it like that kind of relationship.
Can I ask a selfish question real quick?
Yeah, go for it.
I'm obviously house hacking. I live in one half of the duplex, and I have tenants that live in the other half. And so when we signed that lease, I was like, yeah, I'll take care. I'll mow the lawn. I will shovel the snow. I will do all those types of things. And obviously the normal landlord duties, like, repairs, maintenance, like they had a leak under the faucet. I obviously paid for that repair and called the plumber. But when I move out, I no longer would like to shovel the snow in front of the house and take care of the sidewalk. And I would also no longer like to mow the lawn on a consistent basis. You've mentioned you kind of walk through those expectations with the tenants. What's a good way to communicate that to the tenants and explain, hey, the expectation for this new set of tenants is you're going to do that for the property, and not my current tenants. It's going to be you, the new guy, who's going to kind of take over those responsibilities.
Yeah, so it's a little trickier, and I'm sure there's lots of answers if you ask 10 different landlords, but it's a little trickier with a multi-unit property compared to a single-family house, in my world at least. Mm-hmm. And if I have students and they're living in a multi-unit, they're not cutting the grass. Yep. They're not going to be cleaning. We don't have snow that we have to shovel, but they're not going to do any of that. They do have to clean up the trash, though. Trash is our big deal. It's cigarette butts, trash on the ground. And so that's one of the things I harp on big time, is like you have to pick up the trash. If we go by and there's cigarette butts on the ground, that's on you. We're gonna be giving you notice, and there's gonna be a fine. And so, but what I would do, I mean, I hire somebody to cut my grass, but on my single family houses where somebody's responsible, we actually write that down, is that you're responsible for cutting the grass. You're responsible for cleaning limbs off if little twigs fall on the roof. Do you have a ladder? If somebody's renting a single family house from you, one of the criteria you want to see is, do they have a toolbox? Do they actually know how to do anything? Can they get a ladder and go climb up on the roof and pull a few twigs off? That's the kind of conversation I'd have with them. And you'd almost, we actually have two different approaches. Somebody who's an independent person who's living in a house, who hopes going to be there 4 or 5 years, is a totally different tenant relationship than somebody who lives in an apartment unit, who's a college student, who's going to have a little bit more babysitting and kind of all-inclusive kind of thing. So you need to judge. I don't know what your tenant base is going to be like, Scott. Who's going to be your person who's living there when you move out? I mean, are they a young out-of-college person? Or are they somebody a little bit more experienced?
See, in my neighborhood, it really could be anyone. There's a historic community that's been in the neighborhood for a long time, but I'm also right next to an elementary school, so I could see parents or teachers potentially wanting to move in. And I obviously like living there as a mid-20-something guy because it's close to downtown and parts of town where I work. So I've really got a pretty wide demographic that I got no idea who's going to end up applying, and I'm going to accept the first qualified applicant that I think will make a good tenant. But to your point, when I was a tenant, I was a complete wuss. I didn't have any tools. I didn't have any experience. I couldn't repair anything. So I called the landlord every time there was a problem, and I totally get that. So I see your point. If I was living in a house, I'd obviously expect that to be slightly different, probably take a little bit more ownership of the maintenance. So. Yeah,
I've thought about adding this. I had another person I talked to, another investor, who said they would actually have a question on their rental application: what tools are in your toolbox? And if they said, question mark, what? I was like, what's that mean? And
none.
Yeah, none. Okay, that's not good. And they would also ask, and I'm going to add this to mine, is like, how long do you plan to stay at this apartment, at this residence? Mm-hmm. You know, that's a really important question that you're looking for. You know, like how long? If they say 6 months, no, you know, that's not what I'm looking for, and that's not that you can disqualify people for that kind of thing. It's not illegal to disqualify based on income or how long they want to stay. I want somebody to stay 3, 4, 5 years. That's the goal. That's when you make if somebody's moving out every year, you're gonna have a tough time making money in the rental business, because every time it turns over, $500, $1,000 you're gonna spend on turnover maintenance. So one of the most important questions is that.
That's not necessarily true in student rentals, though, right? For example, in your case, you're kind of on that in some ways.
Yeah, I mean, so I have a lot more turnover, and therefore I have a higher operating expense ratio than other a single family house where somebody stays for 5 years, and so I just have to build that in up front, knowing that. But even then, some of my favorite rentals in a college town are grad students who come in. And what I'd really love is that liberal arts grad student who's going to get like this English PhD that's going to take them like 6 or 7 years to write their thesis. That's my tenant right there. Who's somebody, they're a grad student forever, as opposed to an undergrad who's just going to be there for sophomore or senior year, and that's it. And I'm going to look at both of those and say, if I had 2 tenants who were equally qualified, and one was a grad student who might be there 4 or 5 years, the other was a senior year, just 1 year student, I'm definitely going to pick the one who is going to be there a longer period of time.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense to me, and I didn't really think about that because I guess I've moved every year as a college student, but I guess there are plenty of folks that do want to live in the same place for a couple of years. So.
Yeah.
I just wouldn't want to deal with that renting holdover, that 1 week period where I don't have a place to live.
Yeah, it's. I mean, college is one of those things. Everybody has you throw your stuff in your back of your car and you're living in a tent or somebody else's place for another week or so. So it's right. They can handle a little bit better, but even then it's inconvenient. But college town rentals are interesting. We in particular, our town has had very little vacancy for the last 5-6 years. I mean, zero vacancy. If you run it well, you won't have any. I had that 5 days of vacancy, and that's it. So there's pluses and minuses to having that.
Well, you're by Clemson, right? Did you guys just do something big with?
Yeah, Clemson Tigers. Yeah, we were in the finals, college football finals, and against Alabama. So everybody knows about Clemson now. It's a tiny little town of like 15,000 people. There's 15,000 people in the town, and actually half of those are adults. The other half are students. But then there's 20,000 students in the university, and some of them live on campus, some of them live in the town of Clemson, some of them live outside. But the university dwarfs the size of the town. It's amazing.
And just to give a little perspective here, Chad actually played for Clemson, right?
Yeah, back in the day. Yeah, 15. Well, how many years ago was that now? Yeah, I played. I was about 40 pounds bigger, so I had this big old neck. And actually, I'll show you this is my little office. You can see the football helmet in the background. So
the football's up there.
Yeah, I was the Clemson football player back in the day.
I have a question about you. You wanted to know what was in their toolbox. Do you allow your tenants to make repairs?
Not necessarily, no. And I don't have that on my application. So I was mentioning that was an interesting one that I've considered. But no, most of the time I'm not gonna. We're gonna do the repair. I just don't. I know landlords who've gotten into that, and I haven't had the guts to do it. I mean, I'm not gonna say it's not gonna. There's somebody's very professional and they're a plumber. They actually are a plumber, and they tested them out somewhere else. And they could do it, but that's just the exception to the rule. More of the maintenance I'm thinking about is I really want them cutting the grass if it's a house. I want them cleaning up. I want them improving the house if they can. I might consider if they've been there a long time and there's been, they're in the 3rd year and they're about to renew for another year or 2 years. Do they want to paint? If they want to pick their paint color and they'll stay extra and they'll kind of get invested in the house. I think for a house, I don't have a problem with that. And maybe give them a palette of colors. Say no, we're not going to do that color. But I think that's a reasonable type improvement to let somebody do, and if that helps them kind of get invested in the house and stay longer.
Sure. Okay, yeah, that's been heavily debated on BiggerPockets, is asking about, I'm going to make the tenant do all repairs, be responsible for all repairs under $100, or it's going to come out of their pocket. And I don't love that.
Yeah, I think
I think you're going to have a lot of repairs that don't get reported. I think you're going to have a lot of repairs that don't get made just because, you know, and this is my house. This is my property. I want it to be in good shape. I'm not a slumlord.
Yeah.
I want you to take care of it, and I want you to let me know when something's going wrong.
Yep.
So,
well, it's an easy decision for me because I have college students most of the time. And so that's not happening. I'm just trying to keep them from throwing kegs through my windows. You know, that's the heart of it.
Full-time job.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, Chad, is there anything else you want to say about leases or landlording in general? We've been talking about this for about an hour. I could talk to you all day about leases and landlording, but I'm sure you have something else.
Yeah. I got to go sign up a deal actually. But after this, but no, I would just encourage people. You know, we've talked a lot of details and specific things, and I always like to kind of connect this with why we're doing this, because you know there might be some people who love. I actually like the details sometimes, but remember what you're doing this to establish a relationship with a tenant who's going to pay you on time, who's going to take care of your property, and who's going to stay a long period of time, and hopefully even refer people to you. If you have a good relationship with your tenant, and this doesn't mean you're like buddy best friends. This means you have a good, respectful relationship where they respect your rules and it's mutually beneficial. But you know, the big picture here is this is a profitable investment, and this is and this goes back to your why of even investing in real estate in the first place. Like for me, we're planning a trip to Argentina for a year in next January. And so these systems, like we're talking about here, this isn't just like talk. This is like, how can I build some systems where the tenants do a good job and we set expectations up front and we have processes in line, because that's going to pay for my lease down there when I'm living in Argentina, and it's going to pay for food while I'm living there. And so this is if you get this stuff right and if you do it well, you can use it to do whatever else you want to do, traveling and doing another job, getting to have flexibility. And that's exciting stuff, you know, the stuff that real estate does for you. But being good at this and learn. So when you're reading your landlord tenant law and you're like, why am I reading this dry, stuff? Being an expert in something, and particularly in landlording, allows you to have that freedom and that flexibility of having a rental property that pay you for a long time, when other people are kind of complaining about landlording and saying, oh, this is so hard. Well, no, it's just like anything else. You learn a little bit, and this is not a full-time job. I mean, this landlord, if you have 10 properties, I always tell people this, if you have 10 properties, you get those 10 properties paid off, you have the cash flow coming in from those, that will be the easiest part-time job that pays you $10,000 a month that you have ever had. Because I've been on trips and had a call. I was in South America on the Magellan Strait talking in my laptop, and somebody had a hot water heater that went out, and I called a plumber, asked the plumber to fix the hot water heater, closed my laptop, and went back out and went to visit a penguin colony or something right after that. I mean, that's the kind of part-time job this is, when you get it to the point where it's actually, you have some good properties, you have things rolling. And so I guess I'm just encouraging people to, if this is all intimidating to you a little bit, join the party. That's the way it always is up front. But you can learn it, you can get it down, and it's an important thing to get down, because the core part of your entire retirement, if you're using this for retirement or kind of financial freedom, this is the core of it. This system of leases and your relationship with your tenants is like the thing that's going to pay you for a long time.
Yeah.
Wow. That's really, really great. That's really perfect. Go ahead,
I'll
Scott.
see you there in 5-10 years. So.
Yeah. Everybody's welcome to come visit down in Argentina next year too. So we'll have a BP meetup down in Cordoba and have some Mendoza red wine and that kind of stuff. So let me know.
I accept.
All right, good.
We'll take a big trip. Okay. Well, Chad, let's share again where people can keep up with you on CoachCarson.com.
Yep, I write a newsletter, and I write actually every month on the BiggerPockets blog. I have an article there that I try very real estate focused, and I just wrote one on bookkeeping a couple of days ago, so you can check that one out. But then every week I have a newsletter at CoachCarson.com that gets a little bit in real estate, but also just into personal finance and travel and money and how do you work with money and financial freedom. And so you're welcome to check me out there too and subscribe to that for free.
Perfect. Okay, great. Chad, thank you so much for your time today. I really, really appreciate
You're welcome. Yeah.
Talking about leases and landlording with us.
Yes,
That's good talking to you. Yeah, thank you very much. Hope to do it again.
Thanks for joining us too.
All right.
Okay, bye.
Bye.